It was one of those mornings that seemed determined to test every ounce of patience a person had left. For Sarah, who had already been walking a tightrope between exhaustion and hope for months, the morning began in a swirl of minor disasters. Her daughter Emma, 4 years old and brimming with restless energy, had been awake since dawn, bouncing between the couch cushions, humming little tunes, and asking questions that tumbled out faster than Sarah could answer them. Normally, Sarah loved these moments of curiosity and chatter, but today was different. Today was the day she had an interview that might change their lives, the kind of interview she had spent countless late nights preparing for, the kind of interview she could not afford to lose. But life rarely gives way to perfect timing. The sitter who had promised to come bailed an hour before, apologizing profusely but leaving Sarah with no options. She tried to think of neighbors, friends, anyone who could step in, but the list was short and filled with people who had their own jobs, their own commitments. She looked at Emma, who had dressed herself in a mismatched outfit, polka-dot leggings under a frilly tutu, and realized there was only one option. She would have to take her daughter with her. Her heart sank at the thought. She imagined the raised eyebrows, the whispered judgments, the subtle dismissal she might receive if she walked into the glossy corporate office of one of the biggest firms in the city with a child in tow. She had worked so hard to present herself as professional, capable, polished, someone worthy of trust and responsibility. And yet, life, with its stubborn unpredictability, was about to expose the very vulnerability she tried so carefully to shield. She hesitated for a long time, staring at the clock, running through scenarios in her head. Should she call and cancel? Reschedule? No, rescheduling might mean losing the opportunity altogether. She couldn't risk it, so, with trembling determination, she packed a small bag of coloring books and crayons, tied Emma's hair into 2 messy pigtails, and whispered to herself, "We'll get through this." The subway ride was filled with anxious glances at her reflection in the train's smudged windows. Sarah wore her only interview-ready suit, one she had bought years ago and kept neatly pressed despite its worn seams. Emma sat beside her, swinging her legs and holding onto the strap of her tiny backpack. Every time Emma giggled at something outside the window or asked a loud question about the strangers around them, Sarah felt the weight of judgmental eyes and tried to quiet her daughter gently. Yet, beneath the anxiety, there was also a strange sense of pride. Here was this little person she had raised on her own, this reminder of why she was fighting so hard to find stability. She squeezed Emma's hand as the train pulled into the stop. The office building loomed ahead, glass and steel gleaming in the sunlight. It was the kind of place that seemed almost intimidating in its perfection, where people in pressed suits hurried in and out, clutching briefcases and phones, moving with the assuredness of belonging. Sarah felt small as she stepped into the lobby, clutching Emma's hand tightly. The receptionist's eyes flickered for a second as they landed on the child, but she quickly smiled and directed Sarah to the elevator. That tiny flicker, however, was enough to make Sarah's stomach tighten again. On the 20th floor, the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new carpet. The walls were lined with art that seemed to whisper of wealth and refinement. Sarah checked in, her voice steady though her heart was not, and sat down to wait. Emma climbed into her lap, pulling out her coloring book. Sarah tried to keep her daughter quietly occupied, all the while rehearsing her responses in her mind, the way she would talk about her strengths, her dedication, her ability to juggle responsibilities. She prayed silently that Emma wouldn't interrupt at the wrong moment, that somehow they could slip through this encounter without disaster. When her name was called, she stood, adjusted her suit jacket, and guided Emma gently by the hand. The assistant who led them down the hall glanced curiously at the little girl but said nothing. Sarah braced herself for the moment she would walk into the interview room, for the raised eyebrows and subtle sighs she feared would greet her. Inside, the CEO himself was waiting. He was a tall man with silver hair, impeccably dressed, the kind of presence that seemed to command a room effortlessly. He stood when she entered, extending his hand, and then his eyes shifted down to Emma, who clutched Sarah's fingers and looked up curiously at the stranger. There was a brief pause, just long enough for Sarah to feel her chest tighten, before he smiled warmly and said, "And who is this young lady?" Sarah hesitated. She wanted to apologize immediately, to explain away the presence of her daughter, to make it clear she understood this was unprofessional. But Emma spoke first, announcing in her bright, clear voice, "I'm Emma. Mommy's here for a job." The innocence of the statement, paired with the child's unabashed honesty, brought a flicker of something unexpected to the CEO's expression. He chuckled softly and motioned for them to sit. Sarah began the interview, her voice a little shaky at first, explaining her background, her experiences, the challenges she had faced and overcome. Emma busied herself with her crayons, occasionally humming or whispering to herself. Sarah kept glancing down nervously, afraid her daughter would interrupt, but the CEO's attention never wavered. He listened intently, nodding, asking thoughtful questions. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward Emma, and instead of impatience, there was something else in them, something softer, reflective, almost as if he were remembering something distant. Sarah's honesty spilled out as the conversation went on. She didn't sugarcoat her circumstances. She explained that she was a single mother, that she had worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat, that she was hungry for an opportunity not just for herself but for her daughter's future. Normally, she would have tried to mask the struggle, to present herself as if everything had always been smooth, but sitting there with Emma at her side, she found herself unable to hide the truth. Vulnerability seeped into her words, and with it, a quiet strength. At one point, Emma looked up from her coloring and asked Sarah if she could have a snack. Sarah froze, mortified, fumbling in her bag for a granola bar. She whispered a rushed apology, cheeks burning, but the CEO waved it off gently, as though the interruption didn't matter. "She's fine," he said softly, and for a fleeting second, his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood far more than he let on. What Sarah didn't know in that moment was that the sight of the child, the sight of the mother doing her best to balance the impossible, had stirred something deep in the man across the table. The CEO, a figure admired for his power and wealth, was remembering his own beginnings, the moments when his mother had sat in waiting rooms with him because she couldn't afford a sitter, the times when she had balanced work, survival, and love all at once. For Sarah, this was just another test of endurance, another desperate attempt to prove herself despite impossible odds. For the CEO, it was a mirror held up to a past he rarely spoke about, a reminder of the sacrifices that had shaped him. The interview continued with moments of lightness and gravity interwoven. Sarah spoke with passion about her ideas, about her dedication, about what she could bring to the company. Each time she faltered, afraid that Emma's presence had ruined everything, she caught the CEO's expression, patient, thoughtful, almost protective, and found the strength to go on. The longer she sat there, the more she realized that maybe the interview wasn't unraveling the way she feared. Maybe, just maybe, something unexpected was unfolding, something she couldn't yet name but could feel lingering in the space between her vulnerability and his quiet understanding. The moment Sarah walked into the room with her daughter, a memory stirred in the CEO's mind that he had not visited in years. He was a man who, in the eyes of others, appeared to have been born into success. People saw the tailored suits, the corner office, the long list of accolades and assumed his path had been smooth, paved with privilege and connections. They did not see the scars that shaped him, the memories that haunted the quiet hours when the world's noise faded. They did not see the boy who once sat quietly in the back of rooms while his mother begged for opportunities that could keep food on their table. As he watched Sarah sit down, her voice betraying a mix of determination and nervousness, he was pulled back decades to a time when his own mother had walked into rooms like this one. He could still recall the way she carried herself, shoulders squared though her hands trembled, eyes bright with hope though fatigue shadowed her face. She had been a young woman then, younger than Sarah was now, but already hardened by life's unrelenting tests. His father had left when he was too young to remember much about him, and it was his mother who shouldered the impossible task of raising him alone. There had been nights when dinner was nothing more than stale bread and a thin broth his mother pretended to enjoy so he would eat without guilt. There were winters when the heating bill couldn't be paid, and the two of them huddled together under layers of blankets, his mother whispering stories of the future as though weaving hope could keep them warm. He remembered her voice trembling when she thought he was asleep, her muffled sobs pressed into a pillow, but each morning she would rise, put on her neat second-hand clothes, and carry herself as if she belonged in the world that so often dismissed her. One particular memory pressed at him as Sarah spoke. He had been no older than Emma, clutching a small toy car in his hands, sitting silently in the corner of a waiting room. His mother had been interviewing for a receptionist position, her voice steady even as she worried about whether he was behaving. He remembered the way the interviewer's eyes had flicked toward him with irritation, the way they whispered something about professionalism under their breath when she turned to hand in her paperwork. He hadn't understood everything then, but he had understood enough. He had felt the shame in his mother's stiffened shoulders, the silent plea in her eyes when she mouthed at him to stay quiet. That moment had seared itself into him, not because of the judgment, but because of the way his mother had walked out afterward, still holding her head high, even as rejection echoed behind her. It was in moments like those that he had learned what resilience looked like. It wasn't grand speeches or heroic acts. It was the quiet strength of a woman who refused to give up even when every door slammed shut. That strength had carried him through his own struggles, through years of odd jobs, nights spent studying while working full-time, risks that could have ruined him but instead built the foundation of what he now stood upon. Every triumph he enjoyed in the present was rooted in the sacrifices his mother had made, sacrifices that had rarely been acknowledged but had shaped him more than any textbook or mentor. So as Sarah sat before him now, trying to maintain composure while her daughter hummed softly at her side, he did not see unprofessionalism. He saw his mother. He saw the reflection of a story that was painfully familiar, a story written in exhaustion, love, and relentless perseverance. He noticed the small details, the way Sarah's suit was neatly pressed though clearly worn from years of careful keeping, the way her eyes darted nervously toward her daughter as though anticipating judgment, the way her words carried both humility and unshakable resolve. These were details others might overlook, but to him they spoke louder than the polished resumes of countless candidates who had walked through his door. The questions he asked were, on the surface, about qualifications and skills, but underneath, he was listening for something more. And Sarah gave it to him without even realizing. She spoke about working multiple jobs, about balancing schedules, about finding solutions when resources were scarce. She spoke of moments when she had failed but refused to let those failures define her. She spoke not as someone who believed the world owed her something, but as someone who was willing to fight for every inch of progress, not just for herself but for her child. That kind of drive, he knew, could not be taught in any training program. He found himself drawn into her story more than he intended. He had conducted thousands of interviews in his career, heard countless people explain why they were the right fit, but rarely did he feel such a resonance. Each word pulled at the threads of his own past, unraveling the carefully built distance he had maintained from those memories. He could almost hear his mother's voice again, feel the rough fabric of the chair he used to sit on while she answered questions with the same mix of hope and desperation Sarah carried now. It was not pity he felt. It was recognition, a recognition so profound it left him momentarily silent as Sarah finished explaining a project she had once led despite limited resources. He realized then how much of his success had been built not on his own genius, but on the foundation his mother had carved through sheer willpower. Without her sacrifices, her relentless belief that they could have more, he would never have reached the place he now occupied. And sitting across from Sarah, he felt the undeniable urge to honor that legacy, not by charity, not by condescension, but by recognizing the strength and potential that others might overlook simply because of circumstance. As Emma looked up and offered her innocent interruption about being hungry, the room seemed to shift. For Sarah, it was a moment of embarrassment, but for him, it was another echo of the past. He remembered the times he had tugged at his mother's sleeve during moments when she needed silence, the way her eyes had flicked to him with both love and panic. He remembered being that child, unaware of the stakes, simply needing comfort. And he remembered how those moments had never diminished his mother's worth, even if the world around them had acted as though they did. That was when he understood what he needed to do. This was not just another interview to him anymore. It was an opportunity to act on the lessons his past had burned into him, to extend to someone else the chance his mother had so often been denied. It was an opportunity to look beyond the surface, beyond the traditional expectations of professionalism, and to recognize the strength that truly mattered. In that moment, the Millionaire CEO was no longer simply a man in a position of authority evaluating a candidate. He was a son remembering his mother, a boy remembering hunger and cold nights, a human being remembering what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. And as he looked at Sarah and her daughter, he felt something shift deep inside, a mixture of gratitude for how far he had come and responsibility to ensure that the cycle of dismissal and rejection did not continue unchecked for people like them.